This is the Forbes Books Podcast, conversations with remarkable folks who are impacting the world of business and beyond. Hola, I'm Joe Pardavila, and this week I'm welcoming Frank Altman to the podcast. Frank has dedicated his life to creating positive social change through community development finance. He's the founder of Community Reinvestment Fund, a national nonprofit org that provides access to capital for underserved communities and entrepreneurs across the country. He just wrapped up his 30-plus year career at CRF, and he recently published his first book, A New Capitalism, where he offers a systemic argument for why and how American capitalism can be extended to people from every walk of life. Frank, welcome to the podcast.
Glad to be here.
So, Frank, I've had this fraught conversation with my brother-in-law pretty much every Thanksgiving, and my family does not like it. But the conversation revolves around generational wealth. And my brother-in-law is a red-blooded Republican voter his entire life, very conservative. He doesn't understand generational wealth. And I explained to him, I'm like, hey, I'm not going to say his name because he'll get mad. I'll say, hey, how did you buy your house? And I'm like, oh, I saved up money and I borrowed money from my dad. And I'm like, that's generational wealth. For me to try to simplify generational wealth, it's one generation being able to help the next generation buy a home. And for some reason, people don't get this, Frank. And this is one of the reasons why home ownership you've seen all these dips in the Latino and Black markets go down because of this generational wealth issue. So talk to me about how generational wealth has impacted some of the most marginalized communities out there when it comes to either home ownership, advancing, becoming entrepreneurs, and so forth.
Well, that's a big topic. You're hitting on a couple of things. Intergenerational wealth is absolutely at the core of capitalism. When people start businesses, oftentimes they are tapping into wealth that came to them through homeownership, the gifts of family and friends that have resources, and they're able to start a business or buy a house. I remember, and I talk about this a little bit in my book, having a discussion with a significant player on Wall Street about what I thought was a spectrum of investment motivations, going from pure return to what I call investing for love and affection. And so, first of all, you have to have money to invest. And then if you're investing in your family, that's probably an investment for love and affection before you're looking for the return. And you may find that the return is in feeling good about setting your kids on a path to future growth. The problem in many communities, and particularly the African-American community, is there isn't that intergenerational wealth. That community has been, for a variety of reasons, going back to redlining and Jim Crow, for that matter, has been systemically excluded from being able to build this kind of wealth. Very difficult in the 1940s and 50s for an African-American to buy a house in any place that wasn't already a low-income community that was cordoned off from the rest of the developing residential areas. And so the African-American community, by and large, is a community that rents and can't get on that escalator of home ownership that builds wealth. And I think when you look at the role of home ownership, it's essential. It's a basic requirement for moving up into other sorts of investments and asset building. So that has been a big problem.
And the argument that the other side would have on what we're talking about is why don't they just work harder? Why don't they just get another job? What do you say to that argument when it's the idea of work ethic or just not having the right job? What do you say to that?
There's a lot of people with work ethic. They're working 3 jobs and they're still not making ends meet. We have a system, and I talk about this in the book as well, that is increasingly moving all the wealth in the country, or the vast majority of the wealth, into the upper 10%, even upper 5%, upper 1%. So the amount of people who are at the bottom are having a very hard time getting on that escalator, as I said, of wealth creation, if they're just earning the minimum wage, if they're just earning a living and not able to build excess that they can put it into savings. That's part of wealth creation, is having good jobs. Obviously, you don't create wealth just by sitting back and cutting coupons. You have to have some starting point, and that means you're building an excess in income over what your expenses are. Many people are trying to do that. They have kids. They can't save for college. college is another door to opportunity and potential wealth creation. And so it becomes kind of a vicious circle. And that's part of what we need to stop as we look at a different kind of capitalism.
Yeah, now let's get into that different type of capitalism, because the name of the book is A New Capitalism. And Frank, as you know, history shows that capitalism is probably the best kind of ism. The others are not great. And I know capitalism has not worked out for many people, but the alternatives are probably worse. So when you throw around the word new capitalism, what does that mean compared to the existing capitalism?
Good question. I look at capitalism as it is the most amazing way of distributing surplus and building efficiencies into an economy. But it also comes with a major problem, and that is what I talk about in the book, negative externalities. And I don't want to get too wonky here, but basically, every time capitalism is making progress, at the same time, it is leaving the negative aspects to somebody else to come and clean up. And I'm not using this in a very artful way, but you think about our efforts back in the 60s and 70s to start cleaning up the water and the air. Air pollution, water pollution was permitted in capitalism because there was no price put on that. It was not included in the price of any of the goods and services that were being produced, using the air that belongs to all of us, using the water that belongs to all of us. And so a key portion of capitalism, and that's what we fight about, by the way, all the time in economic policy, is the role of government in setting the rules. And if the rules are set in a way that negative externalities like air pollution or water pollution are allowed, then the only way to get capitalism to deal with those problems is to internalize them, which is usually done through regulation. The Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. And as you know, we're seeing in the current political environment a lot of pushback around those regulations, even though there's been remarkable improvement in air quality, water quality. The Cuyahoga River isn't burning anymore. People are swimming in the rivers and streams that were once polluted and you just want to go anywhere near. People are fishing out of places that were once polluted. So we've demonstrated that capitalism can be channeled for the benefit of others, not just for the benefit of the owners of capital, but it's a struggle. One of the components of what I'm arguing in my book is that we need to really look hard at the rules of the game, that policy and advocacy around a just society that works for all, just economy that works for all, comes from that advocacy around the rules of the game. In my estimation, there is no such thing as a free market. Free markets are a construct. They're not unfettered. There's a rule for everything. A free market, if you want to really go back to it, you're talking about Burke and the Leviathan and people basically out for themselves without any rules. So we have rules. We've always had rules in capitalism. And the question is, who do those rules benefit? And how do we make those rules benefit everybody?
Ironically, you brought up the Clean Air Act, which I always like to bring up when I have an argument about any kind of environmental issues, is that Richard Nixon, who some may forget, was a pretty staunch Republican. He was the one who signed the Clean Air Act into law, which I find it so funny because now you're seeing this political divide where, and I know we're speaking in broad strokes here, but it's clearly divided where the left believes in conservation, environmental protections, and the right is like, free markets, do whatever we want, who cares? So it is funny how people forget how a lot of this stuff came about, right?
And it came about because things got so bad. I mean, literally the rivers in Ohio were catching fire because of all the pollution that was going to the rivers. I look back at, I don't want to say how old I am, but I remember reading Silent Spring when I was in high school. We were very resigned to the fact that we were going to lose the American eagle, the bald eagle. Here we are so many years later, and I have an eagle in my backyard in Minnesota. I have a cabin on a lake in northern Minnesota. I see eagles there every time I'm there. And so I look up there, I say, collective action can change things for the better. But it took a lot of work. And there were a lot of entrenched interests, capitalists and others that had financial interest in not banning DDT, for example. So that's part of a new capitalism, is that regulatory environment. And there's always controversy about it. But there's also some great ideas that use capitalist tools to try to reduce these negative externalities. And I'll give you a couple of examples, which right now are not in the main conversation in politics, but I think they should get back there. Back in the mid-'80s, the states in the Midwest that were being affected by high sulfur coal and power plants banded together and they adopted a cap and trade concept for sulfur. I'll use my state of Minnesota as an example, where the lakes did not have the right pH. And as acid was coming down in the rain from sulfur, it was killing the fish. And fishing is a huge pastime in Minnesota. Millions and millions of people go out every year to fish, and they were getting fish. And so it was not a politically controversial idea to say, how can we induce the power companies to reduce sulfur emissions, particularly the emissions that were adversely affecting water in a number of the states where this problem was occurring. And it worked. We got to be thinking much more carefully about how can we use capitalist or market-based approaches to solve some of these problems.
Well, you did reference your age, and I wasn't going to go there, but I want to bring it up because you just walked away from many, many years after founding the Community Reinvestment Fund. Can we reflect back a little bit and talk about the genesis for the company and sort of the lasting legacy of it?
Sure. I founded the company 35 years ago. I just turned 70. I thought, that's half my life. I got to do something else. So here I am doing something else and enjoying myself in what's been less than a month of retirement. Whereas somebody once told me recently that it's really refirement, working on the other things you're fired up about. So the idea for Community Reinvestment Fund came up when I was working as Assistant Commissioner for Financial Management for the state of Minnesota and the Department of Economic Development. I had served as a policy advisor to Governor Rudy Perpich. In the early 80s, we were coming out of a pretty steep recession. There was a lot of pain, particularly in rural Minnesota. Farms were being foreclosed on. There was all sorts of unrest, and people were looking for opportunities to save jobs by having off-farm employment. And so many communities set up small community-based loan funds. They might be through the Chamber of Commerce. It might be through a community organization in some cases. Around the country, there were areas where these funds were set up by churches and religious organizations to try to help their communities. But they were very small. And so if they'd start making loans, they would suddenly find themselves unable to make more loans because they're waiting for the loan that made to repay. So the idea that struck me when I was at the state, and we were really trying to find a way of helping these rural communities at a time when the budget was tight and the legislature was not particularly willing to spend a lot of money, public money, on helping these out. So the idea came out, could we create a market-based system that would buy up these loans, give these communities access to cash that they could then relend without having to wait 10 years for the money to come back. That actually was the sort of idea that would go away for me. Over the course of 35 years, we've brought capital to thousands of primarily low-income communities throughout all 50 states by making markets, by networking with what I would call social ventures, community-based loan funds, many of them nonprofits. More recently, organizations called Community Development Financial Institutions that are certified by the U.S. Treasury to lend in low-income communities. And this network and the building of this network really, I want to say, started about the same time that CRF started. So there was a movement back in 1988, but the idea that one could create market-driven organizations that had a social mission and that used the tools of capitalism to solve social problems, including access to capital in low-income communities. And so that's really the basis of CRF and its mission over the last 35 years.
Wow. And it's funny, too, because you mentioned the 80s, and I grew up in the 80s. The idea of a mission-based company in 2023 sounds fantastic. The idea of a mission-based company in the 80s seems like science fiction. What was the friction like trying to build this during a time of, I mean, I know this is kind of post-recession, but it was really the heyday, the Wall Street greed is good days. What kind of pushback were you getting when you were developing the fund?
Well, it also, I don't want to underestimate this, incredibly high interest rates as the Fed was trying to wring inflation out of the economy. And I hope we don't end up back there in this current effort that the Fed is undertaking. But part of the reason people were losing their farms was because they had farm loans that were getting in the double digits, businesses that had operating loans that they just couldn't afford the interest. And so a lot of the economy was going to teeter as a result of that. But the idea of a mission-driven organization back in the 80s was anathema to both the market-driven system, capitalism, companies and stockholders and so forth, but it also was anathema to the IRS. The IRS couldn't see how the idea of creating a secondary market that supported these basic local nonprofit and voluntary loan funds, and some governmental organizations as well, could possibly be a charitable purpose. And so we set up CRF. We went through a whole process of laying out our plan and why this was going to be a socially beneficial activity. And the IRS said, wait a minute, are you trying to make a nonprofit Lehman Brothers? And they turned us down. So the first challenge that we had was appealing the ruling and saying, you really need to understand this is an innovation in social entrepreneurship, and take a look at this. And they did, thank heavens. And so we really got started in late 1988 and innovated without realizing how maybe far out we were with this whole idea. I have to say there were a number of people that I knew in the investment community in Minnesota and in the philanthropic community, because we are a nonprofit, and or CRF is, and its early days were heavily funded by a few people who, in their foundations, who said, we're going to take a chance on this guy and his idea and see if we can make it work. And so we made it. We proved the concept, and we never looked back after that.
That's awesome. And I always like to use something I call the power of one. You need that one thing to help you break through. And to keep this in the 80s theme, like Tom Cruise needed Risky Business to be a huge hit. You two needed Joshua Tree to take them to the next level. What was the one thing that helped CRF break through, or that you're looking back and like, that was the moment where the bow broke? That was the moment where we were able to break through. Was there a significant singular moment, or was it just something that happened over time?
I would say it's built up from a lot of different initiatives. We did get the state legislature in Minnesota to allow municipalities and economic development agencies to sell loans, because that wasn't clear. That took two different acts of the legislature. So there's momentum going there when you get the legislature behind an idea like this. We did really want to ask the state for money, but they decided to put some money in the bill anyway, so we got a little seed money from them. But I think getting the first deal done and proving that it could be done. I always talk about this with people at CRF and others about one of our key values is innovation and showing the world that it can be done. Not necessarily that we're going to do it all ourselves, but that people were naysaying, you can't ever do this. This is going to be a bunch of crap that you're trying to put in the capital markets. People are going to lose their money, blah, blah, blah. We did a whole lot of these securities that attracted banks, life insurance companies, even pension funds that paid off completely. The only time we ran into any financial trouble, and we weren't the only ones, it was in 2008, 2009, when everything fell apart in the economy and things froze up. So there were some losses then. The organizations that experienced those losses knew the risks that they were taking, and they were taking them in part because they were willing to take the risk on the social good. So that concept of social ventures, and CRF didn't know we were a social venture at the time. We just thought we were a nonprofit that was going to do this thing, really started to snowball in the early 2000s. Now there are many organizations, both nonprofit and for-profit, that I would say are social ventures. These organizations are not profit maximizing. They need to have a margin. No margin, no mission. They're not profit maximizing. They don't need to be. Their owners or their stakeholders are looking for them to solve a social issue, whether it's access to capital, whether it's helping to clean up the environment, better education through charter schools or other educational innovations, affordable housing, as we talked about earlier. All of those issues are not being well served by the capitalism that we know. Building social ventures into our capitalist system will be a way of adding stability and bringing opportunity that the existing marketplace doesn't afford to many people in our economy. And that is the concept of a just economy that works for all.
I love that. And I know you probably have the tangible ROI of the effects of what you've done over the last 35 years, but what do you think the intangible is? Like almost like that butterfly effect of something that you did has now resonated for now multiple generations since you started CRF. Do you have a grasp on what kind of effect you've had over what we started the conversation with? Generational wealth that wouldn't have been there without the help of CRF. I mean, I don't even know how you quantify that, but can you?
Well, when I retired, I got some nice notes from people, and one person sent back to me, says, "You've done a great job. You've helped thousands of people get jobs, build businesses, and they don't know who you are, but I do." So do I have a quantitative answer to that? I don't. I had a discussion with the head of economic development for the city of Minneapolis, and he was so excited. He said, "We've just done a study of the work that we've been collectively doing." This included some major corporations like Wells Fargo, Honeywell at the time, Alliant Healthcare Systems, and others, on what's been happening in the last 5 or 6 years as we have tried to reduce crime and increase development in these neighborhoods. And it was remarkable. So we looked at all the loans that CRF was involved in, and he looked at what's happening with property tax valuations. He said, for the first time, valuations are going up along this corridor, and people owning these buildings are seeing their investment in their real estate improving. And many of the businesses that we financed in those areas owned their own buildings. They were small buildings, they're not big commercial operations, but they were building wealth. I take those data points as maybe indicative of what's happened as a result of CRF over many years and across many communities. But really, the proof is in the stories that people tell, not the numbers, in my view.
Awesome. His name is Frank Altman. The name of the book is A New Capitalism. It's available now. Frank, thanks so much for the time. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Great talking with you.
Great talking to you as well, and that'll do it for another episode of the Forbes Books Podcast. Don't forget to hit subscribe. That way you'll get new episodes as soon as they're available. And if you have a spare moment, I would greatly appreciate it if you could leave a review, which would help other exceptional entrepreneurs like you discover the show. You can always connect with me on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram at Joe Pardavila. And please don't forget the golden rule and treat others as you want to be treated. Thanks for listening. Until next time, adios.